Welcome to the Age of Dragons! No, it doesn't have the same ring to it as World Tomorrow.
So I set my course, my battle begins. There's no mistaking this feeling. I feel no remorse, no I can't resist. I'm breaking away.
So I, once again, can't believe that I've waited this long to actually talk about this game because it's one of my favorite games of all time, period. Dragon Age Origins. It's a Bioware game, same guys who made Mass Effect, and this was back when Bioware was still killing it. Just killing it in terms of every single game they delivered. Nowadays it's possible to throw a lot of shade at Bioware over the decisions they've made over the last few years, but back at the time when Dragon Age Origins was made, golden reputation. And Origins definitely stands as a test for how good Bioware was at making RPGs back then. And I also like to use it as kind of an example for how differing JRPGs and American RPGs can be. Because some people like to talk about them as if they're two distinct things, and I kind of understand why. You may recall that my favorite RPG ever is Final Fantasy IX. It's also one of my favorite games ever. And I don't like Origins quite as much as 9, but it's very, very close. And looking at the difference between these two, you can kind of see what the difference is between a JRPG and a American RPG. JRPGs tend to be a lot more colorful and sometimes have more of an anime aesthetic. The characters often have like effectively superpowers and are jumping around like crazy. Magic is very powerful, and you know, the usual gumph you might get in your typical anime. Whereas American-made RPGs and Western RPGs as a whole tend to be a lot more down-to-earth in their approach to things. It's not that JRPGs can't do this, but it does tend to be more of a common occurrence when it comes to Western-styled RPGs. They're usually more based on medieval Europe, often taking pages out of Tolkien's work in terms of their story and general universe, and they tend to be a lot darker, drearier, and not nearly as hyperactive as JRPGs usually are. The characters don't have any powers that a normal person wouldn't already have. Even those that are mages, you know, have magic, sure, but the magic isn't quite as overblown as it tends to be in JRPGs. Which kind of aesthetic you prefer? I mean, it depends on who you are. I like both, frankly. I think both approaches can be very good if done well, and Origins is a perfect example of an awesome Western RPG. It was built as a spiritual successor to the Baldur's Gate games. If you don't know what those are, well, you're probably too young to remember them. But effectively, Baldur's Gate was a game version of Dungeons & Dragons. It really just converted the entire Dungeons & Dragons formula into a video game. And I think was really the first game, even, you know, beyond those that were called Dungeons & Dragons, that did it in a way that was really good and really fun. Baldur's Gate hasn't aged too well in terms of its overall interface, and it is a lot more difficult to get into as there's just no hand-holding in those games, but I think they're still worth a play if you haven't. And Dragon Age Origins definitely takes so many pages from Baldur's Gate and adapts it to a more modern style game. The gameplay is strategic. You can move freely and attack enemies on your own, but you can also convert it to an overhead view like Baldur's Gate and control your characters independently. How you want to play is up to you, though doing it the second way is very difficult on consoles, so I would recommend not doing that if you're playing on not the PC version. The game lets you set up tactics for each individual character, and these tactics basically tell your AI how to behave. And I thought this was just the coolest thing, because this was the first game I ever played that had this kind of function. Basically, you can tell your AI to do certain things at certain times or in certain situations. It basically guarantees that even if you're not directly controlling them, your compatriots will always be doing the things that you would really like them to do, rather than just let them casually decide when's a good idea to, say, heal you, or cast a very specific spell in a very specific situation. As characters level up, you get more tactic slots so you can make new changes and adapt them to your playstyle. As for your main character, well, you are a newly recruited Grey Warden. The game is set in the land of Ferelden, which is experiencing what is called a blight. A blight is what happens when an archdemon is resurrected by what are called the Darkspawn. There's a lot of lore aesthetic here, but basically Darkspawn are, for lack of a better word, undead. But I guess they wouldn't really be undead technically. Let's just go with that for now, because that's what they look like. They aren't, but they kind of are. They're weird. Anyway, they raise a fallen god, which is what an archdemon is, and it's also a dragon, because of course it is. And the dragon leads into the surface, as darkspawn generally live underground, and they attempt to bring ruin and pestilence across the land. The Grey Wardens are tasked with stopping this, but there's a few hiccups here and there in terms of other enemies you'll have to deal with before you can actually fight the Darkspawn directly. Plot centers around you running around gathering alliances to build an army to actually push back the Darkspawn. Since none of the factions involved actually generally work with each other, elves don't work with dwarves, humans don't work with anybody because they're a pain in the ass, it can be difficult to get them to cooperate. But fortunately the Grey Wardens had treaties that allow them to call on aid from all these different factions in the event of a blight. The problem is that every faction seems to have its own issues going on, and you of course have to be the one to solve all their problems. In typical RPG fashion, nothing gets done unless you are directly involved. As for your particular background beyond being a Grey Warden since you're a new recruit, well that's the interesting part. Dragon Age Origins lets you choose your origin. This was amazing to me. I don't think this is the first game to ever do this, but it was the first time I experienced something like this. During the character creation, you can actually select one of 6 different backgrounds for your character. Now, the backgrounds vary depending on what race and class you choose. For example, if you choose a mage, you can only take the mage background, and there's only one of those, so that can be kind of limiting. But there's 2 for elves, 2 for dwarves, 1 for humans, unless they're a mage, in which case there's 1 different one, and if you're an elf, you have to take the mage one, so there can be a potential of 3 different options for elves, but if you're a mage, it has to be the one. And dwarves can't be mages. Dwarves can't cast magic, so they can't be mages at all. But even though there are limitations on it, the fact that this option even exists, and the fact that you play through a unique story as a result of your choice, and the fact that that story has very, very severe ramifications to the overall story throughout the entire rest of the game based on how characters react to you or, access to certain dialogue branches or things like that. This just blew my mind because level of customization here in terms of your character is far better than a lot of modern games even to this day are. Just the fact that I have more of an option in terms of where my character comes from or who they are as a person or how they behave is fantastic. Again, there are 3 races to choose from, humans, elves, and dwarves, and each of them has 2 genders, male and female. You can of course change their appearance and stats. Then there are 3 different classes, warrior, mage, and rogue. If you pick a mage, like I said, you only get 1 choice in terms of background because mages have to start at the circle. But still, the level of alterations and differences each decision makes here, even in the character creation, was unrivaled at the time. And it's still good even now. All the characters involved are nicely developed, and your party members in particular, especially if you take the time to actually speak with them and increase their opinion of you. Based on your dialogue options and the way you are as a person, this could affect the morality system, but the morality system works differently than when compared to most morality systems in games. Morality systems in games usually go like this, where there's 2 sides of the coin. You're either a paragon or you're a renegade, like Mass Effect. Like, you get 2 choices. You're a bad guy or you're a good guy. That's where you're at. Even stuff like Fallout and things like that do this basic back and forth where it's just black and white. But the way Origins works isn't like that at all. There isn't actually an overall morality gauge or, viewpoint. The way it works is it's purely based on your own party member's opinion of you. Each character in your party has a unique gauge that just tells you whether they like you or don't like you. This changes based on your decisions throughout the game. Each character reacts differently to things you do. For example, if you are noble and constantly help the innocent, Alistair will probably like you a lot more. But if you have a habit of helping people too much or being way too generous, Morgan is probably going to be annoyed by that. Now there are ways to increase it artificially, like just giving them gifts, so like if you give them presents and stuff like that. But I still think that this is one of the best morality systems I've ever seen in the game, because think about it. In real life, what is morality? Well, if you ask that question to 10 different people out there, you're going to get 10 different responses. Everyone has a different moral code. Everyone has a different level of what's right and wrong. Everyone has a different viewpoint on what you should or shouldn't do as a person, and it varies by the individual. So establishing that in the game, the fact that your morality is effectively based purely on the way the people around you see you as a person, I think is infinitely better than any other morality system that's almost ever been done in basically any other game. Sound design is excellent, with superb voice acting performances from all the characters involved. Your character is pretty much a mute, so you don't have to really worry about that, but your dialogue is in the old school list format, which I really like. It's a nice old feel to have this old list instead of the dialogue wheel they would do later, but we'll talk more about that when we get to Dragon Age 2. Sorry. Giving way too much. Okay, so, are there any problems with the game? Well, visually the game, even at the time, was nothing special. It isn't like the most visually impressive game overall. It never really was, but that wasn't really the point. The point was to have this game that was immersive, exciting, with interesting characters and an interesting story that keeps you on your toes and it lasts a long time. This is a long frickin' game, especially if you have all the DLC for it. Bioware designed Origins to be kind of a template for additional DLC chunks to be added to later. There's a lot of downloadable content for Dragon Age Origins, although these days you can get the Ultimate Edition with everything included for a fairly reasonable price. So you don't have to be like me back in the day, paying $60 for the game up front and then spending even more money on the DLC because you loved it so much. Now, to be fair, a lot of the DLC is really, really good and does add quite a bit of interesting lore to the game, particularly the Awakening Edition. Dragon Age Awakening is, well, okay. It's technically DLC for Origins. However, it was released on a disc on its own because it is so large that it can stand as its own gaming experience by itself. It is that big of an expansion. Now, it does carry over story elements from your Origins tale, but you don't need to do that. So in a way, Awakening is the first initial sequel before Dragon Age 2. It's not technically that long, but it's long enough that it's reasonable. And you have to remember, Dragon Age Origins is a long game. Minimum, rushing it, you might get through it in 30 hours. And that's me, and I play games very quickly. But if you're actually experiencing everything, doing all the dialogue, trying to collect everything, we're talking 60 plus, probably 80. It's a long, long game. Awakening isn't that long. It might do you 20 hours, but that's still pretty long for an expansion, let's be fair. There was also a bunch of smaller content additions given to the game, some what-if scenarios and, conclusions to the overall story before Dragon Age 2 came out, but there's a wealth of content even within the original game. Just exploring around, doing the side quests. I usually don't do side quests in RPGs, but I wanted to in Origins because I wanted to experience the world they had crafted. On the surface, it looks like a typical Tolkien-esque RPG, but if you actually experience it, you're going to find one of the most captivating stories and interesting characters to learn about compared to almost any other game I've ever played. Bioware knocked it out of the park. If you like Mass Effect for the characters, you're gonna love Dragon Age for the same reason. It doesn't play at all like Mass Effect, obviously. I already explained that the gameplay is much like Baldur's Gate, where it's strategic. You have to run around. If you're a rogue, you stab people in the back. If you're a warrior, you smack stuff really hard. And if you're a mage, you cast spells. But even if you're just playing for the story, it is so worth it just for that. I can't say enough good things about it, but you're probably wondering, is there anything I don't like about the game? Well, I'm gonna try hard here and try to find a complaint for you, because I like to be critical and see that there's ways that could improve. I mentioned that the graphics are nothing special, but we're gonna leave that alone, because whatever. What I will say is that while I do like the combat, it can get very tiring at times, especially for such a long experience. You really will be engaging almost the same way every time. It's always going to be the same kind of deal, particularly since, you're always using the character classes. I mean, yeah, you could change your armor and your weapons, but generally, once you lock yourself into a fighting style, you're never gonna change it. The same goes for any of your other characters. Every character has a preset of which class they're supposed to be. Yeah, they can learn additional skills and you can change their tactics a little bit, but for the most part, you're gonna find your flow about 10 hours into the game, and there's never really a reason to change it that much, unless, of course, you're on the hardest difficulty setting, in which case you might have to change it often, arguably too much, because the game will wreck you if you don't. So there's that. But overall, Dragon Age Origins is such a good game, and I would implore you, if you are a fan of American Western-style RPGs, you're a fan of Tolkien's work or any kind of Western novelizations of like a medieval, swords and sorcery kind of setting, you are going to adore Dragon Age Origins if you have not already. Now that I've done this, I know I have to talk about the sequels, and I'm already dreading that, but you're gonna have to give me a few days to gather my thoughts about 2, because listen to me. Okay. Follow me on this. I have already spoken my piece about Mass Effect 3. But understand that while Mass Effect 3 does have its flaws, up until the end, it was a very, very good game. I cannot say that about Dragon Age 2, which was the first time Bioware hurt me. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.